The warnings came long before the bidding ever started. Men whispered along the rail of the Billings auction yard, shaking their heads at the giant gray draft horse locked in the far pen. They called him unpredictable and risky, the kind of mistake that could finish a man already close to losing everything. But none of them knew what the Montana Hills were planning for that night. None of them knew the choice that horse would make when the mountain finally gave way. Winter had swallowed the Miller farm whole. Wind swept across the open plain with a sharp whistle, the kind that sounded too alive to be wind alone. It rattled loose window panes and pushed hard against the old farmhouse, as if trying to get inside. Outside, the world was buried under heavy white. Snow filled the fields where golden grass once rolled warm and high, leaving nothing but a cold, empty stretch of land that seemed tired of holding on. Evan Miller stood on his front porch, shoulders hunched against the cold. His coat had lost most of its stuffing over the years, and every breath rose like slow smoke in the gray morning light. He stared across the yard toward the empty corral. A single halter still hung from a rail, swaying when the wind hit it just right. It looked like it was remembering the weight it once held. Rusty had been more than a horse to Evan. After losing his wife, after months of trying to hold a farm together when he barely had the strength to stand upright, Rusty had been the only thing that answered the quiet inside him. That gelding had listened when no words came, understood the stillness Evan carried in his hands, and walked beside him long after hope had gotten thin. But 2 nights ago, on a patch of hidden ice, Rusty fell. One slip, one sharp crack, and the vet's soft words had ended the last steady thing Evan had left. The silence in the corral felt heavier than any snowdrift. Now the farm leaned toward failure, the way a weak fence leans before it breaks. Evan stepped off the porch and crossed the yard. The barn door groaned when he pushed it open. Inside, the smell of hay and cold earth drifted around him. Tools hung neatly along the wall, reminders of a time when he believed he could fix anything. The old cart Rusty used to pull sat untouched in the center of the barn, waiting for a horse that was never coming back. "You were supposed to help me through one more winter," he said, voice barely reaching the air. Outside, the wind howled again. The cattle in the shed had ribs showing beneath their winter coats. The roof leaked in 3 different places. The stack of bills on the kitchen table only grew taller. A farm could take a lot from a man, but this winter felt like it was testing how much he could lose before he gave up. By the time he sat down at the kitchen table, the sun had already started to sink, though it wasn't even past 4. The radio crackled from the corner, fighting through the storm to announce weather warnings and the growing number of livestock losses across the county. Then came the last words of the broadcast, the only ones that made Evan lift his head. Local livestock auction this Saturday. Quote, "He didn't have enough money, not really, barely enough for feed, let alone a good horse. But he knew the truth as well as anyone. A man could not hold a farm together with only his 2 hands. He needed help. He needed another horse. Not a perfect one, just one strong enough to pull a cart, move cattle, and stand through long days that didn't leave room for weakness." He pulled out an old notebook from the shelf. His wife used to write grocery lists in it. He flipped to an empty page and wrote only one line. "Billings auction Saturday. Pray for something I can afford." Saturday came cold and sharp. The sky over Billings was a washed-out silver that made it impossible to tell where the clouds ended and the freezing air began. Evan drove his old truck down the icy highway, the heater long dead and the steering wheel cold as iron beneath his hands. His breath fogged the inside of the windshield as the miles rolled by. The auction yard was already buzzing when he pulled in. Trucks lined the lot. Men stomped snow from their boots, their breaths clouds in the morning air. Inside, the noise hit him in waves, auction calls, shifting hooves, gruff voices discussing bad winters and worse luck. He walked slowly along the pens. Quarter horses with bright coats and sharp eyes. Appaloosas tossing their heads at every sound. A calm draft gelding with a price tag far above anything he could reach. A nervous mare who would buck holes in barn walls. A thin gelding who flinched at every shadow. Then he reached the last pen. A giant stood inside it. A gray gelding taller than any working horse Evan had ever seen. Shoulders wider than a doorway. Mane hanging in heavy strands, half trimmed and half wild. Old scars marked his ribs, faded but clear. His eyes were deep and dark, like water holding a storm beneath its surface. "That's the one who kicked through a trailer door," someone muttered. "Dangerous. Can't trust him." Evan didn't move. Something about the horse spoke to him. Something quiet, tired, and familiar. Inside the ring, the auctioneer called. "Lot 42. Big fella here. Bit of a handful. Opening at 500. Silence. 400? Nothing. 350? Head shook. 250? No one raised a hand. Evan swallowed hard. His envelope held only a little more than that. Buying this horse could go wrong in every possible way. A risky horse was no small gamble for a man already drowning, but he lifted his hand anyway. 250, he said. All eyes turned to him. The gavel struck. Sold. And when Evan stepped toward the ring, that giant gray horse tilted his head, just a small, quiet movement, as if trying to understand the man who had chosen him when no one else would. For the first time since Rusty died, something warm flickered inside Evan's chest. Not hope, not yet, but the beginning of something he hadn't felt in a long time. The beginning of a partnership neither of them knew they would need when the mountain finally moved. The road home felt longer than it ever had. Snow drifted across the highway in slow ribbons, and the old truck rattled with every mile. Evan kept glancing into the side mirror, watching the shape of the giant gray horse standing inside the trailer. Atlas did not thrash or stomp. He did not fight the walls around him. He simply stood still, steady as a mountain stump, taking in the road's bumps with a quiet, unreadable calm. For most men, that stillness would have been a comfort. For Evan, it only stirred questions. A risky horse wasn't the same as a broken tool. If Atlas exploded in fear or turned wild, the damage would be real, not something a hammer and nails could fix. But turning around wasn't an option. Rusty was gone, Winter was still hungry, and a farm did not care about a man's doubts, only his decisions. Snow began falling again as he backed the trailer into the barnyard. By the time he opened the gate, night had settled across the land like a heavy blanket. Evan expected a bolt, a sudden panic, a flash of all the warnings he'd heard whispered at the auction. But Atlas stepped down the ramp, slow and careful, each hoof placed, as if testing the earth before trusting it. Inside the barn, the world softened. The light was warm, the hay smelled clean, and the old wood creaked in a gentle welcome. Evan led Atlas to Rusty's stall, the largest one, with high rails and space enough for a draft horse to move easy. He unhooked the rope. Atlas did not crowd him. He did not turn away. He simply stood, ears flicking as he learned the sounds of his new home. Evan filled the feeder and set a fresh bucket of water inside. Atlas lowered his head, sniffed the hay, then ate in slow, steady bites. For a moment, watching him in the warm stall, Evan felt something in his chest loosen. Maybe the warnings were wrong. But when he reached out to brush a patch of snow from Atlas's flank, everything changed. The horse tensed so sharply that the air itself seemed to tighten. His muscles locked, his head snapped up, ears pinning flat. He didn't lunge or kick, but he froze the way an animal freezes when touch once meant hurt. Evan pulled his hand back at once. "Easy," he said quietly. "No harm here." Atlas didn't move. He didn't blink. He only breathed, deep and slow, holding still like he was waiting for something that never came. After a long moment, his shoulders softened. Not fully, but enough. "I won't rush you," Evan whispered. Night settled deeper around the barn. When Evan turned off the lights, Atlas stood facing the stall door. Not fearful, not angry, just watchful. Two quiet souls learning the shape of trust. Inside the house, Evan sat near the window, staring at the barn's faint glow. The farm still felt too big for one man. But now, for the first time since Rusty's final breath, he wasn't completely alone on it. The next morning broke pale and cold. Mist drifted low across the yard. Evan carried a bucket of feed to the barn, ribs aching from days of hard labor. When he opened the doors, warm air wrapped around him. Atlas lifted his head, ears turning toward him with slow curiosity. "Morning," Evan said. He bent to grab a bale of hay. His boot hit a slick patch hidden beneath loose straw. His feet flew out from under him, and he hit the ground hard. The breath slammed out of his chest in a painful rush. Atlas reacted instantly. The giant horse jerked his head up and stepped forward, filling the stall opening with his massive frame. His eyes locked on Evan, sharp and alert. He didn't rear, he didn't panic. He simply lowered his head until his muzzle hovered above Evan's shoulder. Warm breath brushed his cheek. It wasn't a shove. It wasn't fear. It was a question. "Are you hurt?" "I'm fine," Evan panted, though his ribs burned. Atlas didn't move. He watched every small shift, every shaky breath, as if ready to brace against danger the moment it showed its face. Slowly, Evan pushed himself to sit. Only then did Atlas step back half a pace, still close, still watching. A strange emotion stirred in Evan's chest, something he hadn't felt since Rusty. A kind of quiet connection that didn't come from fancy training or perfect breeding. It came from something older, deeper. "Guess we both have some things to work through," he said. Atlas blinked once. It looked like agreement. From that moment on, their days fell into a rhythm. Not easy, but steady. Evan never rushed the horse. He spoke in a calm voice, moved slowly, and praised the smallest steps, because for a horse carrying old scars, small steps were victories. Atlas learned to trust the halter rope. He followed Evan at a walk, stopping when asked, turning when guided. He learned to lift each hoof so Evan could check the shoes, though he trembled the first few times. He allowed gentle brushing along his neck and shoulders, though his eyes softened only after many quiet mornings. Some days he froze again, startled by ghosts Evan could not see. But each time the man simply waited. Trust wasn't a single leap. It was 1,000 tiny choices. Hank Dawson stopped by one afternoon, leaning on the barn door, while Atlas dragged a small stump out of the thawing field. The draft horse pulled slow and steady, hooves sinking deep in the soft earth. "Well now," Hank said with a laugh. "That, the same wild horse everyone was scared of." "He listens," Evan said, adjusting the rope. "Not the way most do, but he listens." Hank nodded. "Some animals don't shout their troubles. They keep them tucked under the hide. Takes longer to reach those ones. But once you do, they're the kind that stay." Evan looked at Atlas. The horse flicked an ear his way, calm and certain. They trained through the early days of spring. Fences were cleared, debris hauled. The field slowly returned to shape under Atlas's steady strength. He pulled a cart with slow confidence, learned each path along the farm, and began standing beside Evan, not with fear but quiet companionship. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but something was growing between them. Something patient, something strong enough to stand when the land itself decided to fall apart. And neither of them knew that a storm was already building in the mountains, one that would test everything they had built together, and everything Atlas had carried alone. The storm didn't come with thunder or warning. It crept in the way trouble often did in Montana. Quiet, slow, and hidden under an ordinary sky. By late afternoon, a heavy gray curtain rolled over the mountains, darkening the light in a way that set every animal on edge. Even Atlas raised his head toward the ridge, ears sharp and tense. "You feel it too," Evan whispered. Cold wind rushed down the hillside. The rain began in slow, heavy drops that hit the ground like footsteps. By dusk, it was falling hard, turning the earth soft and swallowing old cracks along the northern slope. Evan had been watching those cracks for weeks. Winter had worn the ridge thin. Meltwater had seeped deep into its belly. Now the land trembled under the weight of the storm. He checked the cattle. They shifted nervously near the shelter, hooves slipping in deepening mud. Lightning flashed behind the clouds, a pale flicker that lit the ridge for a brief moment. That was when he saw it. A long, dark line forming across the hillside. A new crack, wider than before. "No," Evan breathed. "Not now." Another groan rolled through the earth, low and deep, like something ancient waking up. Then the ground moved. Not fast, not slow. A heavy slide of soil pushing forward, dragging trees and rocks with it. It was heading straight toward the cattle lot. Evan ran. He sprinted through the storm, slipping and stumbling as mud clung to his boots. His flashlight jumped wildly, beams slicing through rain and wind. When he reached the barn, he didn't hesitate. "Atlas!" he shouted. The horse was already standing alert, eyes fixed on the storm outside, muscles tight beneath his gray coat. Evan grabbed the harness, fingers shaking so hard he fumbled the buckles. "We don't have time," he said. "I need you." Atlas stepped forward on his own. The wind shoved the barn doors open when Evan pulled them wide. Rain slapped their faces. Mud swallowed their boots. But Atlas walked into the storm without fear, each step steady, as if he already understood the danger waiting ahead. The cattle were trapped near the broken fence. Mud sucked at their legs, pulling them down inch by inch. A young steer bawled as the slide pushed closer, dragging debris toward him. Evan tied the rope around the first cow's chest and shouted the cue. Before the words were fully out, Atlas leaned into the harness. Muscles rippled under his soaked coat. He pulled slow and strong, fighting against the sucking mud until the cow stumbled free. "Good boy," Evan yelled. They moved to the next one. Then another. The rain grew heavier, turning the lot into a churning pit. The earth above them cracked again, louder this time. "Faster!" Evan shouted, but speed didn't matter now. Only strength did. Atlas dug his hooves deep into the mud, pulling harder than he ever had in training. The rope strained. The cow bellowed. Finally, the mud released her with a wet pop. A new rumble shook the ground. Evan looked up and froze. The top of the hill was collapsing. A wave of earth, dark, thick, unstoppable, broke loose and thundered down the slope. "Atlas, move!" Evan yelled, but the horse wasn't looking at the mudslide. He was looking at Evan. In the blink of an eye, Atlas lunged sideways and swung his massive body between Evan and the oncoming wave. The edge of the slide slammed into Atlas's flank, mud splashing across his legs. The force shoved him back, hooves slipping, but he braced, anchored like a living wall. Evan was untouched. Atlas took the hit. The earth finally settled, falling still as the storm began to ease. The cattle huddled away from the danger, trembling but alive. Evan dropped to his knees, breath shaking. Atlas stood above him, sides heaving, coat covered in mud, but his eyes steady and clear. "You saved them," Evan whispered. "You saved me." The big horse lowered his head and touched his muzzle gently against Evan's shoulder. A soft, warm breath in the cold night. A promise. By morning the land lay quiet under a pale sky. The mudslide had carved a deep scar down the hill, roots and stones jutting out like broken bones. The cattle were tired but safe. Evan walked the ridge until he found Atlas standing near the edge, still watching the hillside, as if expecting it to move again. The horse looked older in the soft light. Stronger. Wiser. A survivor of storms, both inside and out. Evan laid a hand on his neck. "You didn't just save the cattle," he said. "You saved this whole farm." Atlas exhaled, slow and warm. The vet, Marlene, arrived soon after. She checked Atlas carefully, running her hands along his legs, his ribs, his shoulders. Her eyes softened. "You know what he is?" she asked. "He's northern heavy stock. Old blood. Horses bred to think, not just pull. They were built for danger. Smart enough to read land, brave enough to protect the one who leads them." Evan stared at Atlas, the truth settling deep. "He moved before I did," he whispered. "He was protecting you," Marlene answered. These horses don't give trust easily, but when they do, they give everything. Over the next weeks, the farm healed, the land firmed. Fences were fixed, the cattle regained weight, and Atlas stayed by Evan's side through every long day, every repaired gate, every quiet evening where the world finally felt steady again. Word of the mudslide spread. Before long, the Agriculture Board invited Evan to bring Atlas to a spring showcase in Bozeman. Not for trophies, not for showmanship, but because horses like Atlas were rare. A reminder that the best strength was the kind that protected. At the event, farmers and ranchers stopped talking when Atlas walked into the ring. Not in awe, in respect. There was something almost old world about him. The judge studied the horse, then nodded. "Not many like him left," he said. "Take good care of that one." Evan smiled. "He takes care of me." When they returned home, the sun was sinking behind the hills. Evan led Atlas out of the trailer. The horse stepped onto the familiar earth, lifted his head, and breathed in the scent of the land he had saved. Evan placed a hand on his neck. "We made it," he whispered. Atlas lowered his head until it rested gently against Evan's shoulder. The same gesture he'd offered the morning after the storm. 2 survivors. 2 partners. 2 souls who had learned to trust again. And beneath the Montana night, lined with rising stars, Evan knew one truth deeper than all the scars they carried. A risky horse hadn't ruined him. A risky horse had saved everything.